So I've needed a proper home for our bikes for quite some time, including the bike rack and any other accessories. So this week I'm going to finally share with you how I built one with the double doors at the front that bolt from the inside, and a 5-lever lock single door tucked away at the side. And they're all hanging up with heavy duty hinges. So if you want to make one yourself, then keep on watching. Oh, nearly forgot. I'm going to timestamp everything below because there's a lot to this project. So if you want to keep skipping and going back to parts to follow, I'll leave them below. See you in a bit. And I'm starting with the base first using tannalised timber. I'll also leave a link below to a free set of plans. I put the two long lengths together, pulled out the tape measure to 4 foot next to the timber itself, and that left me with 43.5 inches excess. So this was how long I needed my spars to be, and cut 5 with a handsaw, 2 of which would of course be for the sides. For the very end ones though, I pre-drilled before screwing so I didn't split anything. For the middle ones, I went straight for my impact driver because it's so much quicker. Then toe-nailed 2 of the sides down to the workbench so I could measure and check for square before nailing down another side. When you're squaring up large panels like this, it really does help to have another person at the other end. Now, I was going to just ply line the base, but in this case, it was much cheaper to use tannalised tongue and groove instead. So I had someone trim off the groove section in a matter of seconds before I nailed it down, because the industrial table saw here is really scary and vintage. However, the crosscut saw here is much less intimidating, although still should be respected. And I continued nailing until I got to the end and marked where the last piece needed trimming before finally nailing it down. Now, I know the shed method that I learnt off my dad last year sometimes confuses people, and one comment said it was a really long way of doing things, but it's his quick method that he's learned over 50 years of making sheds in his lifetime, so I'll try and explain it again. Because we know that the base is square, it's then used as a template for squareness. All the frames for the sides of the shed are then built while laid on top, and this drastically cuts down time needed with a tape measure. The base is also a fraction smaller because if it's an exact match, you risk it being too snug when screwing all the shed together. That's why, while starting on the back panel's framework, I have a slight overhang before temporarily toe-nailing it down to the base. However, because this bike shed has 2 lots of doors, a single one at the side out of direct view and some double doors at the front, I planned my flashings on the side, not the front. And the flashings are these trim bits that are nailed to the edges of where the panels meet on the corners. But later the expert said I was doing it the wrong way round and that they needed to be on the front. This was later rectified though, before I started building the side panels. Anyway, back to building the slightly too long front and back panels. I lined the other batten with the one I'd toe-nailed down, but as this is the back taller panel, it slopes downwards towards the front away from the fence. And because I'd imposed a height limit on my shed, I had a few things to deduct to make sure it was going to be discreet and never taller than the fence panel. So I had to subtract 3 inches for the roof, 3 inches for the base, and the depth of these 2 battens. That made these spars 62.5 inches long, and I evenly marked them. But don't forget, before drilling and screwing the opposite batten on, I also needed to ensure it was square by nailing the side spars to the base's edge before carrying on. So now I've got a base that's square and the back panel is square too. But before I even start cladding it, I'm going to now match this back panel to make the front panel. The only difference is this will be shorter in height for a slope. I'm temporarily nailing the bottom batten of the front panel down to the bottom of the back shed panel, although I do generally prefer temporarily screwing it down to stop any movement while hammering and then remove the screw. There is a knack to getting that right first time. But hopefully you can see by now that the idea is no one's wasting time measuring everything again and again. Customers can get their made-to-measure sheds done quicker, and it can be done in a smaller workshop. And it might not seem it because of the camera angle, but the frame for the front panel is 4 inches lower. but I couldn't risk making the front double doors too low, meaning me and my husband would have to keep bending down to walk in. But when it came to the spars, most of the front panel would be taken up by double doors held by heavy duty hinges. So I screwed in some wide CLS spars either side to allow for them. In fact, all of the other framework is also the same CLS timber, but it's all ripped in half. Oh, and this is where the front and back panels needed to be reduced down and screwed back for the flashings to be at the front, not the sides. This then meant I needed to make the side panels just a little bit wider than the shortest edge of the base. Then I screwed some timber between the door hinge spars at the top, which I'll also add some stop lats later, but I also added an extra piece if I ever wanted to screw guttering there with the roof falling towards the front. And that's a front and back frame done. And it's time to work on the two smaller sloping side panels. Again, nailing down the bottom panel first along with the other panel's bottom one, but with it being a slope, I'm screwing two longer than I needed spars either side. So it gives me space to cut them down in a minute to match the shortest and the tallest point of the front and back panels. But to keep those spars still and work out where to cut them, I also temporarily screwed the bottom batten of the last panel that I needed to make across the upper part of all three of those spars. Then I could transfer the high spars point on this timber, not the height of the top batten, and repeat on the opposite side with the shorter panel spar. Again, I have a longer batten allowing me to cut it down in a minute, but meanwhile I match those two pencil marks, which should then be on a slope, and drew along it on the inside. And once I'd cut that down with a handsaw, I could screw that longer batten on top, which created the perfect height to match the shorter and the taller front and back panels. And trim the excess down to match. Now I can remove the next panel's bottom batten that's temporarily holding those spars in place, then finally toenail it to the bottom of that panel I've just built and match it and copy it. If you're not going to have another side door, this is where you'd match all of the spars that you see here, but I'm also adding one with a 5-lever lock. So I added more CLS timber spars here for sturdy hinges. And another piece horizontally for the top of the door and an angled noggin for extra support. So, ladies and gentlemen, all of the framework is done except the roof, which we'll sort out later. Before I started cladding, it's important that we're cladding on the correct side. I'm using tongue and groove for this, and I started with some shorter cuts around the door opening. These are cut down to match the width of the bottom spars, but it's also a good idea to check whether your wood is bowing or not by placing it around the middle with this same cut. And that first piece also needs to be overhung, and that will act like a skirting around the shed base. Make sure they've all slotted in properly so it doesn't affect the rest. That's something that I now always get obsessed with from previous mistakes. And after removing the temporary one and getting towards the top, I'd stop where I'd need a long piece to run across the top and then repeat on the opposite side of the door until I was ready. And I'll be removing the excess off that later with a flush trim router bit. But before that, I drew where the top of the frame was so I knew where to nail them down, and for now just trim the side edges and set aside. The next panel was nice and easy as it had no doors. I just nailed down cladding, checking everything had gone in properly, and they were all the same length. And then I'd have to dismantle my stack of shed panels to get to the next panel. This one is the front one, and I'm cladding again along the side doors and keep repeating until I get to a long stretch. Finally, I meet the first panel that I made, the back, that taller shed panel. I think I say this most weeks, but I'm now using my favourite tool, a router with a flush trim router bit. For anyone who's new here, the one I'm using has a bearing at the bottom, which cuts any excess off while it's matching the template underneath that I want to copy on the door openings and the roof's battens. And before I started on the roof and doors the next day, I had help propping up the panels on the base so I could screw them all together and see it taking shape. The next morning, I screwed down some roof locator blocks directly on top of the two shorter panels frameworks, making sure they're flush on the inside, but also short enough so I could run some roof spars along the front and the back. I'll show you in a minute. But the roof's cladding will later sit directly on top of it, and this gives me another area to anchor down the roof from the inside. Next, I squared the shed panels on the base, checking the overhang was even all the way around before screwing them down. The screws don't have to go all the way down, just enough to keep the panel still so I don't accidentally knock it out of square. But before I show you the roof build, I'll quickly skip ahead to the bit where I nailed the flashings. These are those strips of wood that I talked about earlier, covering the edges where the shed panels meet in the corners and that it's level with the top of the roof. I also added these at the sides of the door openings as well. Now back to the roof. I positioned a long batten along the front and marked with a 3-inch overhang on both sides. Then took it to the back, lined that up again and marked where the spars were. Then I could transfer those marks to another batten so I knew where my spars needed to be, but this time an extra 2 spars that would sit on the inside of the shed's panels so I could sandwich them with screws later. I checked for square again with a spare pair of hands before cladding it with more tongue and groove. Or you could use plywood or OSB as we did for the summer house, and it's all going to be covered with felt later anyway. Once a roof was positioned on top, I started nailing some trim above the doors and some more trim just underneath the front and back lip of the roof. I was half dreading the time it would take to build all 3 doors because I was originally just going to do a double door, but it was recommended to me to go for 3. But it wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be due to the stacking method. To get the width measurement, I do recommend reading my Build a Wooden Gate blog post. I started on the single widest one to start off with, and after making it square, I also learned another little trick, and that was to glue and screw a larger block on the inside of the frame, but made sure the screws wouldn't block where I needed to drill holes for the lock itself. Then use some offcuts so I could line it up and mark where I needed to cut them on an angle for some braces, and pre-drilled and screwed on an angle. That's my big one done. I then use that stacking method again to make my next 2. With these ones being much narrower, or if you're installing a really lightweight gate or door, some say you don't really need a brace, but to be on the safe side, I added a small one on the bottom of each door and 2 smaller wedges above and below the 2 spars on the bolt side. And I'm sure you've seen enough of me cladding already in this video, so I'll just quickly tell you that all 3 doors this time were cladded vertically in a contrasting direction where the overhang still matched the rest of the shed. Then 2 flashings, one either side, but I had to make sure that I didn't nail where that lock was going to go. One job that I forgot to record though, so I'll show you from a previous project, and that's to cut out a notch at the bottom with a handsaw to match the overhang of the cladding so it shuts properly around the bottom of the panel. And my last job that day was to treat it, although I'd run out of time after I'd finished the doors. So the following morning, I wisely returned with my overalls on to finish staining the shed. And while that's drying, I returned to all the doors as they'd dried overnight. So I'd like to say a huge thank you to Hyatt Hardware for sponsoring this project. What made me chuckle was that, coincidentally, I didn't realise that my dad was already a customer of theirs because I found this big box of Hyatt hinges and pad bolts while I was on my way out after the first day. I'll pinch one of those later. But I went for these really stylish heavy-duty reversible ones for my doors. They also sell hooks, shelving brackets, locks and much more, which you'll see in the rest of this build. And if you like something that you see, there'll be a link in the description below. So I lined the main body of the hinges to the top and bottom spar and offset the screw mounts by about 5mm. With them being heavy duty, I'm using thicker screws for these, and really I should have been best pre-drilling before screwing. Luckily I got away with no splitting. For the single gate, I put it in position, resting it on the bottom of the panel's frame, and lifted it up with 2 pieces of wood and my foot controlling it, so I could quickly screw the bottom hinge plates on And once I had enough screws to support it, I added the rest of them, but knowing I'll have to replace them later with security bolts. For the double doors, I had to put both in situ to see what allowance I had between them, then prop them up with some shims to keep them in place while I screwed the rest of the hinges on. To stop the doors from pushing inwards and potentially damaging the hinges, I also screwed 2 stop lats on the inside, lower than the top of the door's frame, and also one along the side of the single door. Then screwed another bolt at the bottom and top of one of the doors, making sure they didn't drag on the frame while in an open position. And this is where I pinched an oval pad bolt from my dad's Hyatt stash for the second door. So the idea is that I'll be bolting it from the inside and then locking it on the single door with a 5-lever lock on my way out. And it was this that I was excited to brush up my skills on. The beauty of this one though is it's reversible without having to unscrew the latch to make sure it's facing the right way. And it's the 2 cover plates that keep it from moving. I'm now getting an idea of where I wanted my lock, then drew along the body of it on the front edge of my door. But a tip though is to make sure you leave enough room to screw your handle on if using that block method. I just got away with this, otherwise I would have had to glue and screw another block above. And I drew a centre line between those 2 lines using a combination square and drilled a series of holes with an 18mm auger drill bit, starting just above it and slightly deeper to reduce any chiselling time. Then placed the lock back and drew around where I needed to chisel around the plate of it. I'm not a pro at chiselling, so I take my time, but I like to have a go because practice makes perfect. And so does the sharp chisel, which I still need to learn how to sharpen. Once that was a good fit and not too tight, I needed to put the lock on the side of the door, line it up, and draw a mark to drill a 12mm hole for the handle spindle and an 8mm hole for the keyhole. Again, using more auger drill bits. I'll give you a tip though, avoid getting distracted while the drill just pokes through, so you can avoid splintering on the good side. I didn't make that mistake with the keyhole bit. After making enough space for the keyhole, I then pre-drilled and screwed the plates on, following the handles, but definitely make sure that you can get your key in okay still. For the lock keep, to save you measuring obsessively like I'm doing here, something that I learned is just put the keep bit over the lock, close the door as much as you can and draw the position of that on the door frame side. I'm working out the centre again for drilling. And this time used a 22mm hole saw and repeated marking and chiselling out so the whole plate would be flush with the trim. Now we're on to felting the roof. So I rolled out a length across the front with a deep enough overhang to cover the wood and clout nailed it all the way along. And instead of slicing the corners, as I've done previously, I blanket folded it, which is tucking in the excess, and continued nailing. For the next half, I found a strip that was lying around with a slightly different shade. Let's put it this way, I don't have OCD. I'm totally fine with this, and it does the job, and I nailed that all along the back as well. And where that shorter bit overlapped, I marked on the longer side with a hammer and where I could see spars for the roof's framework. Then pulled back the top bit, applied roof bitumen just along the inside of that hammer mark, and a zigzag shape before putting it back. Pressed it down with a plank of wood and nailed one clout nail on the shorter piece in line with those spar marks. I then nailed some stained trim all the way around. And sliced the excess off with a Stanley knife. But I left the back one overhanging because no one will see. Then one more stop lat to cover that gap between the double doors. And drilled some bolt holes for later when screwing it all back together in its destined location. Although I'd numbered all the panels to put in the right order, I forgot to draw on the inside of the frame on the base. So when I brought it home, I'd be able to get it square quickly again. I also didn't bother with the sub base underneath because it's going on paving where the rain seeps through. So depending on your ground, you may need one. And while someone's supporting the panels and poking those bolts through, I'm screwing it together and tightening the nuts on the inside. Bolts! I'm trapped in a box. Okay. We also needed a wedge underneath to get the shed level, otherwise your shed might not be able to lock. To secure the hinges, I then drilled one hole per hinge mount so I could thread through a bolt and fix with a washer and locking nut on the inside. I was gutted when I ran out of the perfect length bolt, so I had to get my angle grinder out and remove the last protruding few and filed any sharp edges away. For storage, we don't have a lot of bike accessories, or at least yet, just a few bits and bobs. So I'm now mounting a rack of hooks on the back of the doors. Then some more that I picked for bungee cords. And I was really impressed with how strong all the hardware is, including these vintage style hooks that needed to hold the weight of our bike rack when not in use. And for a quick shelf for hats and things, I found another offcut of OSB in my shed, marked where the spars were at the back so I could go away, jigsaw some notches out and then return to screw some London brackets on. I've trapped it. And screw from underneath. Easy peasy. Don't forget, I'll leave some free plans below if you want to make one yourself. And hopefully, I'll see you in my next one. Thanks for watching. Bye. I'm not really locking myself in here.